make it clear.
Order.
Well, I did not make the comment.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my ever-revolving panel of bloggers and opinion shapers, here's a former Green Party MP, well-known social justice activist and political commentator, Keith Locke. And here's the political columnist for the NBR, consultant, commentator and moral shepherd of the right, Matthew Hooton. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, Richard Prosser. Is he racist? What are the ramifications for New Zealand First? And does this reflect poorly on MMP? Issue 2, Salvation Army gives the government a D for child poverty, housing and employment. What is the government doing? And issue 3 tonight, John Key's decision to take Australia's refugees. What do we get? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. New Zealand First MP Richard Prosser wrote an inflammatory piece for Investigate magazine where he called for all Muslim-looking men to be banned from Western airlines and asked for them to go back to Wagistan. This racist dribble was spat out apparently because Richard Prosser was denied being allowed to fly with a pocket knife on a domestic flight. Seeing as the only air terrorism New Zealand has ever faced was from a woman on a regional flight and a Pakeha male trying to fly his plane into the Sky Tower, Richard Prosser's comments came across as very 2002. Matthew, I've always said that the political freak show that Winston brought into Parliament would implode before 2014. If Brendan Horan could be sacked for very little evidence, why isn't Prosser being kicked out?
Well, I think Winston Peters is in a very difficult position, and in some ways I feel sorry for poor old Prosser, because a case can be mounted that what he was doing was articulating the basic beliefs of his political party. And if we go back to 2005, Winston Peters gave a speech where he didn't attack terrorists or fundamentalist Muslims, he attacked moderate Muslims, he said, because he believed that they were shielding fundamentalist terrorists in New Zealand and that Muslims were a serpent in New Zealand society and this sort of thing. So that is the basic type of belief of New Zealand First, if you look at Winston Peters' career, and that's probably what attracted Richard Prosser to that party. And he's written a column which takes Winston Peters' basic views on Muslims perhaps just to a slightly, to the next logical step. And he probably thought that, well, he was doing his job. I mean, if you're a Green MP, you're meant to go out and promote environmentalism. If you're a New Zealand First MP, your job is to go out and promote hatred. And you know, the way he has been criticised, I could imagine he's thinking, well, wait a second, that's what I'm here for.
Does this kind of bigotry have a place in the New Zealand's political spectrum? Should it be represented?
Well, in most Western countries, there is sort of between 5 and 15% of the population who are broadly supportive of this type of politics, the politics of hate and anti-immigration and so forth. And so it's not a question of should it be represented. If you're going to have a proportional representation system, you're going to have a party like this in your parliament.
Well, let's get into that. Keith, Richard got a paltry 500 odd votes in his seat, but he got in on the coattails of New Zealand First's high party vote. His ascension to our parliament, is it a bit smelly for MMP?
I don't think so, because the party vote's the one that counts. So they get over 5%, they get their party list in. Everyone knew that Richard Prosser was on that party list, what he stood for. He'd been writing columns like that for 10 years. And as Matthew says, racism is core to the New Zealand First policy. And that 2005 speech, I think everyone should go back and read that in the election period, where Winston Peters talked about a militant underbelly and said the moderates and the militants fit hand in glove. Those were his exact words. So he's attacking the whole Muslim religion. And Richard Prosser is just in that context. But the people I would blame most are the people, the George Bush administration and the Clark and Key governments who have, you know, created all this hostility to Muslims around the war and terror. And I was in Parliament seeing the other politicians from National Labour and New Zealand First, attacking the Islamic people, and including people like Ahmed Zawi,
That's right.
attacking
That's
refugees, etc., etc. This was part and parcel of the war on terror. So if anyone should apologise, it's the Labour and national politicians and the American politicians who have driven this thing and created the fetid sea in which the Richard Prossers and the Winston Peters can swim. And we've got to turn that around.
Do you think it's embarrassing to have someone like Prosser as a representative in our House?
I think it's a bit like New Zealand's environmental record. When that was exposed overseas, it should be used as a motivation for us to improve our environmental record. Similarly, when it's exposed overseas that there is this element in the New Zealand population, it's represented in Parliament, and it's good that debate's out in the open involving MPs. It should give an impetus to us to, really carry through this debate and try and reduce the proportion of the population that have these racist views.
Matthew, our racism is generally pretty casual. It's aimed at Māori and Asians because they threaten Pākehā dominance of the economic structure. Do you think having a go at Muslims is going to be able to get any political pull in New Zealand? It's a bit 2002, isn't it?
Oh no, this is going to be great for Winston Peters.
Really?
He's back in the headlines. It's a core issue. It's a dog whistle. I mean, what the type of people that he targets, the losers and weirdos and haters of our society, they will have heard that a New Zealand First MP agrees with them, and they will have heard that Winston Peters didn't really tell him off, not all that much, and they will be reminded of the speech that Winston Peters gave in 2005. That's being reported again in the media, where he described moderate Muslims as serpents and so forth, and it's great for Winston Peters.
So you think that this is going to benefit New Zealand First?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Do you?
Whenever he attacked, look, if you look at his history, I mean, when he first became a national MP, what was his? He reckoned there were Russian submarines operating off Great Barrier Island, and then he reckoned that the Cook Strait ferry had scraped its bottom on Torrid Channel, and he's attacked sickly white liberals and Maori, and he's attacked Somalians and Asians. It's always good for him.
And his biggest votes have been in 1996 and 2002, when he really cranked up the anti-immigration message. And I think it's important to see that, like Richard Prosser's talking about more targeting and profiling, etc., and trying to back off a bit his previous comments. But in fact, if you talk to Somalis, for example, every time a Somali citizen, a New Zealand citizen, of Somali origin, comes back into the country, they're stopped and interrogated. Where have you been? Who do you know? There's this targeting and racism going on right now, and that's a result of this whole war on terror, and this terrorist threat being built way out of proportion.
Mr. Hooton, be honest. Do you think New Zealand First planned this?
No, I don't think they planned it, but
they don't have that sort of foresight.
I think when Winston Peters heard about it, he didn't see it as out of the ordinary. He heard it about 3 weeks ago, and I think Winston is a sly old bugger, and he'll know exactly why this will play well for him politically.
Yeah, I don't think it was planned, but on the other hand, he has known all along Richard Prosser's politics, and that Richard Prosser, one day or another, was going to strike a note with something like this.
Richard says he's sorry because it wasn't balanced enough. I mean, Fox News isn't balanced enough, but referring to countries as Wagistan and telling people to go back on their camel rather than that's just basic ignorance. Shouldn't he apologise, as Hone Harawira suggested, in a mosque, not Parliament?
Well, he's not.
Well, I don't think he should. If these are his real views, why should he apologise for his real views? It's his real views I criticise, and are offensive to me, offensive to the whole Islamic community. So we should argue on, combat prejudicial words with tolerant words and have that debate, not say apologise or fine them. Or
Final question to both of you on this. Should other parties rule out working with New Zealand First? Matthew?
Well, I won't vote for any political party which doesn't rule out a coalition with Winston Peters, obviously. So I suspect I'm going to be voting for the Libertarians this time. Because, I mean, from John Key and David Shearer's perspective, look, nobody...
they've damned him, but they haven't ruled it out,
I think it's responsibility of the media and voters, ordinary voters, to say, I need to know whether you will deal with that man and make him your Deputy Prime Minister and so forth, because I think it's legitimate information for voters to know whether Shearer and the Greens on one hand
And
or
it should
National will deal
alert
with them.
us to the danger of these right-wing populist, nationalist, anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic parties that have flowered in Europe and have transformed the politics of some countries for the worse. And we've got to be very alert to that. Winston Peters, New Zealand First, have got away over the last few years. We're not quite like them. Sure, he talks about immigration a bit, but he's not really a populist, racist, nationalist.
Well, he isn't though.
Well,
I mean, the thing
enough.
about Winston Peters, I think this is a very important point, is that he doesn't keep any of his promises. I mean, some of those parties you're talking about in Europe, when they get power, they try and implement what they've said prior to an election. But Winston Peters
says anything.
He was against asset sales. He sold Auckland International Airport. I mean,
things like the immigration profiling group that's holding up the visas and citizenship and residence of thousands of people at the moment. That was a result of his attacks against Muslims in the.
Are you a little disappointed the Greens haven't ruled out cutting a deal with New Zealand First? Are you a little disappointed?
I don't. I think it's too easy to just say, well, rule out working with this party. I think the main thing is to really fight them at this time.
Well, the Greens kind of agree with them on a lot of issues, like...
Oh, come on, that's taking it too far.
No, the Greens have a similar xenophobic attitude to issues of international trade and international relations.
They want to make sure that New Zealand is looked after for its sovereignty.
Well,
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. In its latest State of the Nation report, the Salvation Army are giving the government a D for child poverty, housing supply and youth employment. For the last 5 years, child poverty has remained around 21%. Youth unemployment is at its highest in a decade, and there's a deficit of 16,000 state homes. But don't fret, Deputy Prime Minister Bill English says that many of those issues have improved in the last year. Keith, I'm told by the Child Poverty Action Group that when Bill English met with them, he referred to them as the misery industry. Is this government paying lip service to the inconvenient truth that their policies enable the wealthy and really do bugger all for people on the bottom?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The report, I think it came out yesterday from the Locke Family Centre, supported by the unions and others, for, I think it was $18.40.
That's right.
Not legal minimum wage, but a wage that should be implemented across the economy. And I think it's interesting, that discussion whereby it's not just the legislated minimum wage, but trying to get councils and governments to implement it, set the pace, and apparently in London some steps have been made in that direction. And that would perhaps force some of the private employers to say, well, look, we've been left behind here, and increase wages. The present minimum of $13.50 is just completely inadequate. People are really starving. I think all the articles, all the literature on that shows that very clearly. So there's, I think parties and the government should get behind that proposal for a start.
Do you think the government's paying lip service?
Yeah, they're paying lip service. They've got this complete deregulation, free market approach, and just let wages settle as they will, and of course wages settle very much down the bottom.
Matthew, your very, very, very good friend and possible future leader of the National Party, Simon Bridges, has come out saying that he has some sympathy towards the living wage. How does the government inoculate itself from criticism that it's not doing anything about poverty?
Well, I think on the living wage concept, it's information. Primarily, I don't think anyone's talking about this being legislated or becoming the minimum wage, but it's probably useful to have some type of figure that roughly we think is provides the sort of lifestyle we think is appropriate.
The basic necessaries.
I think, the living wage is set slightly above that. That's the whole point of it, isn't it? That it's not just survival, it's about making sure you do have leisure time, you can go to the pub, you can...
Quality life.
I think, it seems, it's very complex. I did work for Angela Folks when she was head of the Superannuation Task Force in 1999, and there was work going on there to look at what an elderly person would need to live on in New Zealand. But of course it's so different. If you're in Auckland, it's different from Invercargill. But it's even what people's expectations are determines what the living wage is. If someone, has not had children, but is into their pets, right? Part of the living wage for them in retirement will be the ability to keep having pets for company. someone else who has a large family but is dispersed around the country, what it means for them to be part of our society, it's going to cost them more because they're going to have an expectation to see their grandchildren. So I can't see how you can say 1840, 1820, 1910. I mean, I think it's a bit more complex.
So the
than this
government
campaign
has
is
to
saying.
manage expectations. Is that how it gets around the criticism of poverty?
Well, the government has done a quite poor job on explaining where New Zealand sits internationally.
Right.
In the sense that our youth unemployment has gone up as a result of the global financial crisis, but it's still very, very low internationally.
Sure.
If you look at countries that the Labour Party often speaks of, socialist Europe,
Yep.
I mean, in places like Sweden,
Yep.
their youth unemployment is vastly higher than ours because of the dead weight costs of the welfare state.
So you would suggest that Bill English sings "We don't know how lucky we are" in Parliament, and that will carry the day?
That would not be the right tactic. But there is a context here that our unemployment is actually very, very low compared with the rest of the world in these times.
Keith, the spin from the right is that the global economic recession has occurred, and yes, bad things have happened, but the global economic recession doesn't explain the Māori and Pacific Island unemployment rate being 3 times higher than Pākehā. Those are stats that suggest a failure of policy, don't they?
Yes, you've got to put the resources in. They're doing whanaora and a few things like that, but it's still small potatoes, really. You've got to invest, and
are we seeing that?
we're not really. We're seeing cuts actually in government expenditure in different departments, many of which affect Māori and Pacifica
Except
people.
in welfare. I mean, the welfare budget it continues to go up. It's now 20.
More people are unemployed.
It's now 25 billion.
Yeah, more
we
people
spend
are
on this a
unemployed.
year. You know, I think, well, yeah, but unemployment is relatively low. Still at 7 point, well, it's down to 6.9
Well,
now.
almost
but
8.4 if we included the people who disappeared.
it's well less than socialist Europe.
Well,
But you know, the question is how much more. I mean, the report gives the government excellent marks for early childhood education. I was yesterday at the former Education Minister Speaker's Locke Smith's valedictory, and the first policy initiative he mentioned that he was proud of was the launch of Te Whariki, the early childhood curriculum guidelines in the early 1990s. And I think a lot of work has been done by successive governments in that area, and the Salvation Army has acknowledged that.
In terms of work, though, getting a good state housing program going, as proposed by Labor and the Greens in different ways, the rent-to-buy program of the Greens, it's going to require a lot of budgetary expenditure in the beginning.
Yep.
But there's a big payoff in terms of increasing the number of people at work, reducing poverty substantially.
Although I'm not sure that the massive state housing developments, cheap housing in Britain after the Second World War, the housing estates, I don't think they did much to alleviate poverty. I think they caused it.
It depends what sort of state housing you
Well,
do. If you do it in these big separated tower
Yeah,
blocks,
yeah, where you just
in
say
England, it
that's
doesn't
right.
work.
The sort that the Labor Party and the
But at
Greens
the
are
moment,
talking about.
at the moment, you've got a net loss of 300 state
Yeah.
houses
That's
in
right,
the last
that's right,
financial
that's right,
year.
that's right.
Because what's happening is any state house tenant that lives in what's deemed to be a wealthy area gets
They get
a
kicked
house
out, that's right.
Well, it is a
from
very
under them.
that's a very difficult rationing question, isn't it? I mean, I see Brian Rudman would like there to be 50 to 100 or a number anyway of cheap housing down at Wynyard Quarter on the
Yes.
Auckland waterfront.
Yes.
Now, that you would expect houses or apartments in that part of Auckland to be worth many millions of dollars.
Yep.
Who are the 50 lucky families that are going to get
We'll
them?
do it as a lottery.
That
Look,
is very difficult,
In the
isn't it?
past, governments did have what they called a pepper potting
They did,
approach,
yes.
where
Yeah,
they
yeah,
would
yeah.
consciously
Yeah.
move into expensive areas with more expensive land and build houses there. It's going to cost a bit more,
Yeah.
but it's worth it.
Matthew,
it
going,
does
going,
create social
going to the
unfairness,
electorate
of
in
course.
2014 for the government and declaring we made the 1% even richer isn't much of a political vision. They can't rely on their track record to date. Will we see a government that's just about attacking the opposition for the next 2 years?
Well, I think there's going to be legitimate questions about what the structure of this Labour Green Hone Harawira government will look like.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at the polls now,
They're winning.
I think the working assessment is that David Shearer will be the Prime Minister, that
Yep.
Russell Norman will probably be his deputy or the Minister of Finance, and that Hone Harawira will have some type of role. The question, of course, is Winston Peters whether he would come back as David Shearer's Foreign Minister or
Yeah.
something like that. But I don't think it's illegitimate for people to discuss the nature of that government versus the alternative, because at the moment it's a bit idle to talk about a third-term John Key government because it doesn't look very likely.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, John Key's decision to take Australia's refugees has been universally attacked by every organisation working with refugees. Last year, when the government introduced their noxious immigration amendment bill to establish Australian detention camps, it was to stop people smugglers exploiting these refugees. Last week, that was all forgotten when we agreed to take Australia's boat people, and the argument of encouraging people smugglers was quietly swept under the carpet. Matthew, I put to you that there is more chance of me becoming the next leader of the National Party than a boatload of refugees coming to New Zealand. What are we getting out of
Well,
this?
that's right, and also, of course, anyone who does manage to sail from Indonesia
Should get a round of applause,
should
shouldn't they?
immediately be appointed, should join Team New Zealand.
That's right,
Be
exactly.
taken up to San Francisco.
Yeah.
So no one has ever got here, as far as I know, as a boat person. I think we,
Other than Māori,
I
of
think
course,
as
who
New
originally-
Zealanders, we don't have a good, because of that, because no refugees have ever reached New Zealand.
Yeah.
I don't think we have a good feel for Australian politics, where it really is a big issue over
Right.
there. And what you've got is a failing Labor government in Australia who needs to look tough, and so against boat people, to stop the
Right.
Liberals from being able to accuse them of being soft on boat people.
Right.
And so I think you see this in this context, that she wanted to be able to go back to Australia and say, I've got the Kiwis to take 150, and John Key agreed to that. And in exchange for that, the deal was, it's the student loan collection issue. And when the student loan scheme was set up in 1991, first proposed by Phil Goff and then implemented by Lockwood Smith, there was talk of trying to do bilateral arrangements with other countries' tax departments to collect student loans from Kiwis when they were on their OE.
Right.
Well, that work began by the Treasury in 1992, and all the other countries said, we don't want to collect your student loans for you. It's your problem.
Right.
So that was the deal that's
Right.
been done.
I don't, sorry.
Yeah, Keith, Serco runs our private prisons and the Australian detention camps. How much of a factor are they in us agreeing to this?
I'm not sure that's the case. I think it's just to help Australia. You know, New Zealand government's always trying to help Australian governments, the small boy helping the big boy sort of thing. I think that's more behind it. I don't disagree myself with taking some of the boat people. In fact, I supported it when Helen Clark took some of the boat people from the Tampa.
Yes,
I supported it over the last few years when, in bits and pieces, New Zealand's taken some of the Sri Lankan Tamil boat people, and I think it's good they're taking 150 in there now.
So they won't be held in detention camps here?
The big, hopefully not.
Right.
Because they'll all be pre-approved anyhow.
Right.
So, but my big problem from the Tampa on has been all of these boat people that have come here have been under the 750 quota, which is a miserable quota. Even Australia, which we're criticising in terms of it, takes 20,000. So it's several times in a per capita sense than we're taking. The big problem I have is any talk that if boat people do arrive here, that we're going to send them to Nauru or someplace like that.
Well, they're not going to,
Hell
so we're not.
highs. Yeah, no, but just that concept I think has to be attacked, that somehow New Zealand is supporting the treatment by Australia in these hellholes in places like Nauru, because when I was an MP I used to get letters from people detained there, and they were, you know, just beside themselves. There've been repeated suicides even just in the last month or so.
So are we condoning Australia's detention camps by taking these people?
No, we're not condoning the detention camps by taking boat people. We're endorsing the camps by what the Prime Minister has said, that it is okay to have them in these camps, and it's okay theoretically, and it's just theoretical as we pointed out, for New Zealand, boat people arriving in New Zealand to go there. You know, that's the big problem. That's what's got to be knocked over.
Final question on this. Are we ever going to have any boat people arrive in our lifetime to New Zealand?
If we do, they will be very small in number, and they'll be incredibly talented, entrepreneurial type people who probably would offer more to our country than most of the people let in under the business migrants.
It's about 7,000 sea miles,
that's
mainly around the Australian coast.
This would be a world historical achievement.
It would.
To get here, and so it's interesting that John Key's fallen back on this thing about Australians, the Australian Navy shepherding a boat across the Tasman, which is complete
nonsense.
Someone might have had a joke at a party about it, and Key's taken it up as something
Let's
serious.
wrap the show with a final word. Matthew, your final word this week is?
Coming up next week probably is the judgment by the Supreme Court in the water rights issue over whether or not the government should be injuncted and prevented from selling these shares. Well, you just never know with that particular court. I mean, there's never been an unpopular policy that's been presented to the New Zealand people, voted on. It was the main theme of the Labour Party's campaign to be against it. So whatever you think of the policy, there has never been an economic policy as mandated by the people of New Zealand as this one. The Parliament has voted to implement that policy and sell 49% of these shares. If the Supreme Court overrules the High Court and decides to prevent the government from implementing its manifesto promise, there will be a constitutional crisis, and I wouldn't be surprised if it led to an election.
That is very interesting. Your final word?
I've been very worried about the Speaker's attack on parliamentary rights this week. I went to hear the West Papuan leader, Benny Wenda, speak in Auckland. He went down to Wellington, and the new Speaker, John Carter, said, not John Carter, David Carter, said you can't speak in any of Parliament's rooms, which is, and it's interesting that when National was in opposition, I was in a group with Nick Smith, currently a minister, parliamentary group for Tibet. We had a meeting for the Dalai Lama in a select committee room. Who should chair it but Nick Smith, current National Party minister? And now we have a National Party speaker saying we can't have politics in committee rooms in Parliament, we can't have outside visitors, we can't be informed. This is a real attack on parliamentary rights and, by extension, the rights of New Zealanders.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Matthew. Ladies and gentlemen, my final word. Richard Prosser's absurdly racist diatribe against Muslims because his pocket knife was confiscated seems like the actions of someone with far too much attachment to pocket knives. I once had to remove my belt going through airport security, which was annoying, but didn't lead to me wanting to launch a jihad on Islam. Unless Richard Prosser's pocket knife was magical, made of gold with sapphires set in the handle and gifted to him personally by Queen Elizabeth II, he's a racist offensive clown who has no place whatsoever in politics. Watching all parties damn him but then quietly agree they would still cut a deal with him isn't the kind of strong ethical standpoint most of us would have liked. Out of all the minorities our political parties choose to attack, why can't it ever be the richest 1%? If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.